It's Friday, August 14th. I'm Brian Walsh, and welcome back to This Week in Impact, where I talk with ImpactAlpha journalists and editors about some of the most interesting impact investing stories we've been covering. This week, I'm joined once again by editor David Bank. We'll discuss how the AI boom is supercharging the already attractive economics of renewable energy and battery storage, as large private equity firms raise billions to power the energy needed. Plus, in a guest post, Paul Fellinger argues that as more authority is delegated to AI, demand will only grow for companies that preserve control over data, infrastructure, models, and applications. And finally, we'll shine this week's ImpactAlpha Edge deal spotlight on Woven Earth, which has raised $155 million for a fund of funds for early stage clean tech. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, David. Welcome back to the podcast. How was your summer break?
Oh, it was great, Brian. We had our annual canoe camping trip up in the Sierras, and luckily no fires there this year, although there seem to be fires everywhere else.
Glad to hear. All right, first up this week, who's actually building the power for AI? Our Amy Cortese wrote this week about the asset managers piling into energy infrastructure. Private equity firms like Brookfield, KKR, Energy Capital Partners, and TPG. Tens of billions of dollars are going into this, and the pitch is that the AI boom will supercharge the economics of renewables and storage. So, David, the headline on Amy's piece says that the power is mostly renewable. How much weight is that word mostly carrying?
Well, the first thing to understand is just the scale of the build out. I think folks are familiar with the estimation that the hyperscalers, the big AI companies, are set to spend about $1 trillion this year on capital expenditures on data centers. Now, this play that Amy was writing about is the power to power those data centers. And that is its own investment area. And the scale of electricity needed by 2030 is just staggering. Just by the end of this decade, according to the International Energy Agency, the U.S. is set to consume more electricity for data centers than for the production of aluminum, steel, cement, chemicals, and all other energy-intensive goods combined. So this is energy spike like the likes of which has never been seen. Now, the IEA said about half of that is going to be supplied by renewables, which at some level sounds, promising. But if you think about grid capacity increases more broadly in recent years, it's been almost all renewables. So in fact, the AI build out is bringing on a lot of gas and other sorts of power as well. But this is kind of going to be the horse race because renewables are by far the cheapest energy source, and by all rights should win this race. So there's going to be a lot more power, a lot of it renewable, but also a lot of it non-renewable.
Yeah, it sounds like the data centers are dragging the mix in the wrong direction. If most of the new capacity in general is going towards renewables, but only half of it is for data centers is going to renewables, that's below the share of the overall new capacity. And so therefore that means that the data centers are providing dirtier energy than otherwise we would have.
Well, there's a wrinkle in it, which I think the IEA didn't classify nuclear as a renewable. It's not technically renewable, but it is zero carbon. And then of course we've spoken on the podcast about fusion, which will kick in possibly around the mid 2030s, and is also zero carbon. And so between the modular and fission, classic nukes and fusion, as well as renewables, I expect that this build out actually will be powered mostly by low carbon or zero carbon energy, but even a small percentage of natural gas and other fossil fuel electricity would be obviously not helpful on the climate front. So you're right, this is a climate emergency at some level, but it's also an opportunity for renewables to show their stuff as the cheapest energy source.
Right. It's also part of this, if you will, arms race into these hyperscalers, into building this out. They need as much electricity as they can get their hands on. And sometimes that can come quickly from renewables, but sometimes to scale this up quickly, they need, non-renewable energy. And so maybe this is just the messy middle.
Yeah, and what's interesting, as you said, the Brookfields and the TPGs and the KKRs and the Blackstones of the world are heavy into deal making around power generation to supply these um, data centers. Sometimes it's grid infrastructure, but more commonly it's what's known as behind the meter, and it's actually a dedicated power plant essentially for a data center itself. And they're not making a climate argument or even a renewables argument in this. They're making a power capacity argument to supply these data centers. And again, so if it happens to be renewables, all the better, but they'll do whatever it takes. And
So unpack, help me unpack this phrase behind the meter.
behind the meter just means it never gets to the grid itself. It means that it's a self-contained. Some people might even call it a mini grid, but that's sometimes you think of that sort of powering a village in Africa. This is essentially electrical generating capacity that sits on the footprint, generally speaking, of the installation itself. It could be a steel factory or aluminum factory, but in this case, it's a data center, and it could be a solar array or a mini nuke or a natural gas plant that just powers that data center specifically and doesn't actually contribute to the grid. Sometimes there's kind of grid tie-ins, and the excess power and the balancing can be done through the grid, but behind the meter means it's on your own property.
Now I'm going to use the B word, the bubble question here, right? If this AI build out is indeed a bubble, is it like the comparable to the railroads in the 1800s and the fiber build out in the early 2000s, or the .com of the early 2000s as well, where you have a lot of infrastructure spend, and some of it is misallocated during the exuberant part of a build out, but then there are some lasting legacy infrastructure that is helpful, whether it's railroads or fiber optic cables laid across the country. So what does this potential bubble look like for the AI build out?
Well, this has been, a hot topic for many months now, and a lot of the attention has been focused on what happens when these data centers don't pay off, like the revenue projections required to finance even the credit to build these data centers requires these AI companies to start making a lot more money than they're already making. Where that money comes from, a lot of corporate customers are very concerned about, because they figure now that they've completely transitioned their companies to run on these AI systems, now they're going to start paying through the nose for it. But the data centers might actually become obsolete. You might have a bunch of sort of servers and chips that are no longer modern. It's not likely, I would say, that the power generation would become obsolete, because there's going to be demand for that electricity, from multiple sources, and so you're not likely in any case to ever have too much electricity on the grid. I don't think. Maybe in certain cases or certain markets at certain times, but overall the demand is only going up for electricity, not just for data centers, for electric vehicles and all kinds of other electrification projects. So it seems that in some sense the bubble would less hit the electrical generation. But you're right, folks like Blackfield Steve Schwartzman said on the earnings call that we listened to, that they're mindful of the potential for excessive exuberance. And Brookfield's Sikander Rashid actually invoked those very examples around the railroads in the 1800s or the fiber build out in the 2000s, and said, of course, in one of these frenzies, some of the money's going to be misspent. The fiber build out, of course, is instructive, because the companies, Global Crossing and others that spent billions and billions back then to lay undersea cables and fiber everywhere, went boom and bust in a spectacular fashion. But the fiber remained, and we're all using it now. And I suspect that we'll all be using this new electrical generation capacity on into the future as well.
All right. To go deeper on this topic, check out Amy Cortese's piece, Power for AI, Mostly Renewable, tops the shopping list for big asset managers. That's on ImpactAlpha.com. We'll also have a link in our show notes. Later in the show, we'll take a look at Fund of Funds Woven Earth, this week's Impact Alpha Edge Deal Spotlight. But for now, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, an investor's guide to choice and control across the AI stack. Next up, every investor has been asking how much agency AI will get. In a guest post for us, Project Liberty's Paul Fellinger thinks the money is in the opposite question: what people will pay to keep their own agency. Paul wrote for us this week in the Shaping the Algorithm series, and he's making an investment argument, not an ethics argument, David. His claim is that control over data infrastructure, models, and applications is becoming something buyers will actually pay for, and that most investors don't have a framework for how to price that. So, David, how should investors think about how much control AI users have over the tools they use?
Yeah, Paul was kind of weighing into what is another one of the hot topics in the AI world, which is this question of kind of open weight models. And folks may recall from software wars of earlier decades, open source software. This is kind of the AI version of it. And the question is how transparent and public and free, for that matter, should the underlying models be? And they call it the weights that go into those models. Um, and there's kind of a battle raging, a classic kind of tech battle between the early leaders, in particular Anthropic, which is in favor of what you might call a closed or proprietary model, and then either the also rans or the insurgents, depending how you want to look at it, that are trying to gain a step on those leaders. So Meta's Mark Zuckerberg has penned an essay arguing for open weight models. The Chinese, of course, are using open weight or open source models. And the argument is that those kind of models do give corporate customers and others the ability to see what's going on under the hood, to run them on their own computers as opposed to in these cloud servers, to trade them out when they find a better model or something that suits them better without having their data kind of captive in these systems that they don't control. So a lot of things that corporate customers in particular prize very highly. I mean, again, if you're going to start running your entire company on this technology, you kind of want to have a certain level of control over it. You don't want to be beholden to one provider who then can hold you over a barrel and raise your fees and that sort of thing. So this is going to become the sort of one of the defining battles of the AI age. And the debate, I would say, is tending towards the open weight side. Even OpenAI, which had been on the proprietary model side of the debate, has started releasing some of its earlier and less powerful models under open weight, and they have come out in favor of that. Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, which of course wants to sell chips to everybody, took it upon himself to write a letter defending or at least warning the government against premature regulation of open weight models. And in fact, this month, the Trump administration said that, in fact, these open weight models would actually get through easier. They wouldn't have to go through any kind of government oversight or review, whereas the closed weight or proprietary models would. And one of the things, of course, that's driven this debate towards the open weight side has been these, well publicized breaches, security breaches by the most powerful models of both OpenAI and Anthropic, which have, in both cases, kind of escaped the sandbox that was supposed to contain them, and got out essentially into the wild and went hacking into other systems and did phishing attacks and planted malware, did all kinds of cybersecurity mischief. And because nobody could really see under the hood, it was harder to contain. So the open weight side of the debate is winning in part on the potential to have at least some level of defense against these looming cybersecurity threats.
Now, where does this concept of sovereign AI come into this, and how does that play into this open versus closed conversation?
Well, again, the opposite of sovereign AI is is some kind of captive or colonialist AI, I suppose, where you're beholden to one or two giant global companies that may or may not have your best interests at heart. And the notion is that some kind of proliferation or democratization or distribution of the technology, again, including technology that you could run on your own servers and have local AI, not up in the cloud, to the big hyperscalers. And then in that regard, you could keep your data segregated. In that regard, you could keep hackers out. In that regard, you could, not let your competitors see what you're up to. So corporate customers, generally speaking, like that sort of thing. There are higher costs involved. You're not spreading your costs across the whole infrastructure in the same way. And so you have to bear those costs. And that's, in a sense, what Paul was arguing. How much will those customers pay for that level of control, that level of choice, the ability to switch out their systems when they want to, all of that kind of fine tuning and local autonomy that they've gotten used to in other parts of their business? Do they want to keep that in the age of AI, or do they want to follow the hyperscalers rushing headlong into a world that they don't quite understand?
So, David, Paul's piece was part of our Shaping the Algorithm coverage. How does this relate to our broader coverage of good AI and the kind of responsible stack for AI?
Well, in several ways. I mean, in particular, the notion is that there is going to be a marketplace, an investment opportunity to supply all of these kinds of things that corporate customers want that the big hyperscalers may not supply. And those are things like accountability, auditability, cybersecurity, data control, sovereignty. And so just like the digital revolution and the rise of the internet occasioned an entire industry for the cybersecurity threats that came along with it, the AI industry is now generating a sort of equal and opposite reaction of an AI security, AI autonomy, AI sovereignty world of startups and investment. And that's the case Paul was making, that there will be a vibrant private marketplace, vibrant private investment in making sure that the infrastructure actually meets the needs of customers and of course, as people say, humans, and human agency, but it also means corporate agency in this case. Who keeps control, and how do we keep choices open?
All right, we can read Paul Fellinger's guest post on shaping the algorithm on impactalpha.com. There's also a link in the show notes. For now, we're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, a closer look at the women-led investment fund Woven Earth. Finally, this week, we shine our deal spotlight on Woven Earth, which reached a $155 million final close for its second cleantech fund of funds. Its strategy gives investors exposure to ventures in geothermal energy, battery storage, critical minerals, and other so-called cleantech 2.0 startups. David, generally investors are wary of funds, as any potential upside can potentially be eaten up by the fees on fees that these funds charge. So what's Woven Earth's differentiator here?
You've put your finger on it, Brian, because this fund to funds debate has also raged over the years, and as you say, you can think of an LP, whether it's a pension fund or a family office, putting money into a fund of funds, and they pay them a certain fee on the money they place there, and then that gets put into the fund managers themselves, and they pay another fee there, and eventually some portion of that makes its way to the actual ventures and the entrepreneurs on the ground, and some folks have thought that that's not an efficient way to deploy capital. The converse argument, of course, is that funds of funds allow you to have exposure to many managers and thus many more companies, and you have a diversification play there, which reduces your overall risk. So those things have always been kind of in tension, and the innovation of recent years has been how could you get the best of both worlds? And Woven Earth thinks it has the formula, and others do as well, which is through what they're calling co-investment rights. And so Woven Earth, in addition to the money that they put into these underlying fund managers, reserves about a third of the money they've raised to make direct investments into the companies that those managers are investing in. So the managers do all the homework, do all the due diligence, come to a term sheet, come to a deal, put their fund investments into it, and Woven Earth has that kind of exposure. And then Woven Earth comes in on the side and makes its own direct investment, which it doesn't pay any fees for because it's not being managed by those managers. And so the blended fees between the investments in the managers and the co-investments brings down that overall fee. It's an interesting area because the fund managers used to really resist this for obvious reasons. They're doing all the work and not getting paid. Now they've kind of come around, partly because competitive pressure means they've got to do it, and say, okay, I got my check into my fund. That's great. I want to keep my LP happy. If they want to invest alongside, that's their business, and it's all to the good. And it in fact lets me, the manager, bring even more firepower to my deals, and maybe get into deals with entrepreneurs because I can bring even more money than just in my fund. I also bring along my LP.
So Woven Earth has already invested in 7 funds and made 20 co-investments alongside its GPs, or general partners, which is part of their strategy there. So who are some of the funds that they've invested in?
Well, in the first fund, they were into managers like Burnt Island Ventures, which has a kind of water focus, Trailhead Ventures, which is into regenerative food, but they also got into some very interesting companies. Fervo, which is a geothermal company, it just went public, and I imagine that that Woven Earth had a decent return on that. Pantalasa is one that we like. It's these ocean-based kind of large buoys which utilize wave power to generate electricity, and they've co-located data centers out in the ocean, powered by waves, and then connected back to the grid through satellites. Quite an inventive approach to this very data center power demand question. Overstory, which we've written about in Impact Alpha, which has a sort of AI approach to manage wildfire risk for electric utilities. So they have gotten into some of the sort of leading and most interesting companies in the field because their managers that they've backed have gone out and scouted for these kinds of opportunities.
All right, to go deeper on this deal, there's a link in our show notes to the Woven Earth profile on Impact Alpha Edge, our data intelligence platform that contains the most comprehensive database of impact investors in the world. But that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you for joining me today, David.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure as always.
And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh, Managing Director of the impact advisory firm Human Nature. We'll see you next week for more Impact.